Greetings, heroes. It is I, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier, here at long last. Sorry for the delay in this Monday morning AMA, and just connecting the intertubes doesn't always work the way you think it's going to. Even if you use the same settings over and over again, I found the problem, I fixed the problem. Totally my bad. I really want to send some gratitude to the people who have stuck around to watch this broadcast anyway. So thank you for being here. It is my delight to stop any feedback in the sound. In any case, thank you for being here, everybody. I just want to celebrate. We have a new member of the Jew Curious School this morning who I'm really excited about. I like to preserve people's privacy if they want to do things privately, so I'm not going to say who it is, but got a new member this morning, got another new member last week, and really excited for people who are joining the Jew Curious School. So you may wonder, why join a school to connect with me and to connect with other people when you can do that 5 days a week live here on YouTube? I'll let the other students speak for the difference of the experience there. People really enrolling and in dedicating their learning has been fantastic. We do some small group learning together each week, and the community that we're building there is, let's say, reflective of the community that we're building here. And we have a number of people in the Jew Curious School who jump into the chat and have really been emissaries, really have been welcoming and things like that. So in any case, so much to celebrate this week, except for starting a few minutes late. I feel like a little bit of a dunce for that, but I'm glad to see all of our friends here. We've got Karen from Canada, Teresa from Cyprus, Sandra from India. So many, let's say, longitudes represented today. Milo's here from Denmark. Let's see. It's good to see Sephora76 here. Sephora76, welcome. Carmen sending out a shout out, Shavua Tov from Nevada. And Susan is here from the Philadelphia airport. I don't know, are you a pilot? Are you just traveling today? But I'm glad you're here. Sephora is here from sunny and cold Ottawa. So Ottawa, I'm less familiar with Ottawa. I know I have a couple of good friends from Winnipeg. I have some good friends living right now in Toronto. Did I say that right? Toronto. So Ottawa I'm less familiar with, but looking forward to getting to know you, Sephora. And of course, Elizabeth is here from Maryland. And Karen wishes us all a happy April Fool's Day. It's not a Jewish holiday, but nevertheless, you know, it's our April Fool's Day. Purim, maybe. You see a lot of the same kinds of stuff. If you ever read the Jewish Journal, sometimes the Jewish Journal will have sort of a joke cover on their Purim edition. So it's the Purim is sort of our, I'll say, Halloween, Mardi Gras, April Fool's Day, all rolled into the one, all while celebrating the courage of one young woman standing up for her people, and the intervention against genocide that would have been terrible, but we made it through that because of the courage of this young woman, Esther. But that's old news, I'm going to say, because pretty much we're going to focus on Passover for the next few weeks. Saying old news isn't probably the best way to teach anything in Judaism. We do have things that we've been learning together about for 3,000 to 4,000 years, and yet I'll persist in championing the notion that they can really shape our lives today. So I take back my old news comment. In any case, this is a Monday morning Ask Me Anything session. So let's do this. Ask me anything. And while your questions are appearing on the chat, I'm going to go ahead and intro the Jew Curious Show podcast. If you're just joining us live for the first time, many times I use these sessions as a live studio audience recording of the Jew Curious Show podcast. And so what we're talking about today, right now, may appear on the podcast later today or later in the week to share with our Jew Curious Show listeners. And what I love about this is that it takes it from just me giving a speech for an hour or maybe interviewing one of our great guests who has a lot to teach the Jew Curious Show audience, but people don't get to ask questions on the spot of those guests or of me. And in this format, you can ask your questions live. I will answer them live. And then by that going into the podcast, you're actually helping other people, other Jew curious people just like you, because hero, chances are if you have that question that you have, many other people have that question, and maybe they don't know how to ask, or they don't want to be on live, they don't have the courage that you do. But by you asking that question, not only do you get an answer, but everybody here gets an answer, and everybody on the podcast gets an answer as well. So you're actually doing a huge solid for Jew curious people just like you. So start those questions coming in. I'm going to take a little bit of a radio announcery voice break to intro the show in case this goes on the podcast later. 1 second, just take a little sip of the rocket fuel. Hero, I have to say, the hallmark of a curious person is the courage to ask questions. Today on the Jew Curious Show, we have another Monday morning Ask Me Anything. That means whatever question you might have for a rabbi is fair game. I will answer those questions to the best of my ability live in front of our live studio audience recording session here. And we'll get into these questions right after this bass. Going to take a little pause here to grab a sound print of silence so that we can edit the sound a little bit better later. I'm going to count to 10, and then we'll get into it. And that was the sound of silence. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and Hadar Ensemble, for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you so much to our live studio audience here in this Monday morning Ask Me Anything session. Your questions are going to be the fuel that fuels our fire today of curiosity. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. This is a place where Jew curious people, no matter where you're coming from, maybe you're Jewish, maybe you're not Jewish, not yet. Maybe you are a firm adherent to another faith, but you're curious about the Jewish roots of your own tradition. Or maybe you're just a spiritual seeker trying on different paths to see which is the right one for you. In any case, Hero, you are welcome here. Just to set some expectations for what you're going to be listening to today, this is a live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show. At this very second, I am live on YouTube, and we've got a minion here. We've got about 10 people have joined us in order to ask questions live. I answer those questions live and then present them to you, Hero, on the Jew Curious Show. If you are curious about taking part in a future episode of one of these live studio recordings, please find me on YouTube. Go to youtube.com. That's youtube.com / Rabbi John Carrier, all three of those words smushed together, and you can see all the upcoming live streams that I have scheduled. You can jump into any one of those of your choosing, ask your questions live, you will get them answered live, and other listeners will have the benefit of learning from your questions. Because, Hero, if you have that question, I guarantee that somebody else has that question too, and you would really be helping them out by having the courage to ask. There's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that says, a shy person cannot learn. Now, then there's all sorts of different personality types, introverts, extroverts, INTPs, ENFJs, things like that. But one of the prerequisites for doing any serious learning, for gaining wisdom that improves your life, is bridging that chasm, covering that gap, having the courage, the chutzpah even, to ask a question. And that's how we get started. So let's go ahead and get started with this episode. One more thing before we get started with this episode, I'd like to suggest that if you have not already, please consider subscribing to the Jew Curious Show. Your podcast listening device will have a button or a picture of a button that you can tap, and then you will automatically download all future episodes and have complete access to all past episodes. That's quite a bit, and all you have to do is hit that button. So take care of that, then put the phone in your pocket, put it out of reach on your dashboard, and settle in for this great conversation with our live studio audience. Let's see who is here today. We've got Karen wishing us a happy April Fool's Day from Toronto. It looks like they had a surprise snowfall there in the past weekend. Looking forward to spring. Me too. I'll say it's gone from 60 to 70 here in Los Angeles recently. Elizabeth is here giving us a Shavua Tov, wishing us a good week from Maryland. Carmen's coming in from Nevada, welcoming Carmen's coming in from Nevada, wishing us a super duper Monday. Not just a super Monday, but a super duper Monday. Sephora is wishing us a hello from Ottawa. Ottawa. We now have at least two provinces of Canada. We now have at least two provinces of Canada represented. Susan is tapping in from the Philadelphia airport today. And we've got, let's see, Milo's here from Denmark. Sandra is here from Goa, India. Oh my goodness gracious. Teresa is here from Cyprus. Suzanne is from Northern California, the exotic reaches of Northern California. Elliot is saying hi from Toronto, or he says Toronto. I thought it was Toronto, but I'll go with Toronto. Maybe that's South Toronto says that. So we've got two Torontonians here. And let's see, Bud Rod's here from sunny Georgia. Dorothy Sue, and Dorothy Sue is saying hello to us. And so excited to jump into these questions today. I see some questions from people I see some questions from people who have been visiting synagogues and are wondering about that. Let's see. Let's see what's going on in the questions here. So Karen's got what I think is a great question. I'm not sure if I'm understanding it completely. Maybe we can elaborate on this. Went to synagogue. So Karen asked, went to synagogue on Saturday, and someone shouted out, "Is that normal? This is my second visit here. When people are ill or facing hard times, can they get a blessing from the rabbi, or do they do anointing or laying on of hands?" That's an interesting custom that we have. It's not so much, we don't do the anointing anymore. That's really reserved for the high priests, of which that's kind of a suspended category in Jewish practice. Laying on of hands, not so much. I can't speak for every single synagogue. However, I can say that in many synagogues, what happens if somebody is ill? Let me back this up. So we have practices in synagogues of recognizing people of different status or going through different things in their life. We talked, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the Zevach Todah and how when people went through travails in their life, like survived a difficult journey or recovered from an illness, there is a practice that we do even today, even though we don't do the sacrifices of Thanksgiving anymore. There's a practice that sometimes when people are blessing the Torah reading, they have an aliyah to come up and say the blessings before and after the Torah reading. There's also a special prayer that goes with that for certain people. If they have just recovered from surgery or recovered from a serious illness, they'll do what we call benching gomel or birkat gomel, meaning if they have survived a serious health problem, there is an acknowledgement of that during their Torah reading blessing session, if you will. So somebody will, they'll bless the Torah reading, and then afterwards they'll say a special blessing, thanking God for helping them get through a difficult time. There is also a place in the Torah service, and just about every conservative synagogue I've been to, and that's where I spend most of my time, is this prayer of healing that happens during the Torah service. Usually near the end of the Torah readings, we'll pause and they'll call it a Misha Berach. Misha Berach is a type of blessing that covers a lot of different categories, but specifically there is one for healing, where we acknowledge the people in the community who are ill, and sometimes we just do it sort of privately. Sometimes there's a list. Sometimes the synagogue will have a running list of people who are in need of prayer for healing. And we might go through that list and name all the names, and then ask people in the congregation, if you have a name to add to this list, please shout it out for us, or we'll or think about it, and we'll include them in our prayers. And so it is a time where we have a normal worship service, we have our normal learning session with the Torah and the Haftarah, but we also like to recognize where people are in their lives, and this is true for people who need healing. This is true for people who have a birthday. I just did a Mishabarik this past week for somebody who had a wedding anniversary, which was really nice. Some people had a special acknowledgement that he was retiring, and so when you have a community of people, it's not just about the community, but it's about the individuals within that community, and each of us recognizing people's different milestones and people's different needs. And so people will get shout outs, so to speak, in these services. And different synagogues do them different ways, but most synagogues that I've been to have some way of acknowledging where people are at, if they merit congratulations and just want to get a good pat on the back from everybody there, or whether they are in need of support, and that support can come in the form of prayer. So to answer your original question, Karen, in a very long and drawn out fashion, yes, it's absolutely normal to give shout outs to people if they are in a time of celebration or if they are in a time of need. So let's see what else is going on. So Elliot shares with us, as a rabbi, what are your views on the sorry, I'm going to back that up a little bit. Elliot asks us today, as a rabbi, what are your views on the LGBT community, specifically the trans side? I recently started going to a Reform synagogue who are very relaxed about my being trans. Is this standard? And so the answer I want to give, and I've done a whole video on this in the last couple of weeks, so check the archives. We talked about this for about an hour, in which I was very clear on my views of LGBTQIA and folks. I've learned there's a new word, folks, that gets appended to that. I want to honor everybody in that space because I want to honor everybody in that space, fully acknowledging that every human being is created in the image of God. And you might look at human diversity today and say, how is that possible? Well, because God, right? God is such that God could create billions upon billions of people in God's image, and that could be true for each one of them, and every one of them still be different. There's a Mishnah in the Sanhedrin about this, is that, why did God create all of humanity from one model, that is Adam Harishon, the first human? And this is to show God's glory and majesty and capacity that, by comparison, a human king will make, a stamp for a mint that he strikes coins off of, and every single coin stricken off of that mint will be identical. However, the king of kings, or queens, as the case may be, can strike billions of coins from a single mold and each one be unique. And this may sound far removed from what we're talking about, but I fully believe that every human being, gay, straight, trans, A, I, Q, etc., is created in the image of God and deserves dignity inherent in that status. And so I have a different read on things like Leviticus 18:22 than many rabbis or religious people have, and I explained that fully in another video. I'll sum up to say, you are welcome here, and I'm super glad you are welcome in the community that you're involved with locally. I don't know that welcoming is standard, but it is increasingly normal, and I think that's a beautiful thing. So, as with anything else in Judaism, there is a diversity of opinion. Your community may vary, your rabbi that you know may vary. However, I think it's a blessing in our time that there are more and more communities, more and more rabbis, more and more Jewish people who are accepting more and more of us. And so I hope that answers your question. Maybe it's not the norm for every community now, but we're working on it. So let's see if we can find another question here. Let's see. Susan asks a great question about synagogue architecture. I've been in a couple of synagogues and have noticed, sorry, I'm bumbling my words here a little bit this morning. That's the thing about a live recording, is you get all the bloopers. I've Susan asks, I've been in a couple of synagogues and have noticed a sort of ornate lamp hanging down in front of the ark that holds the Torah. Does that lamp have a significance, or was it just coincidental decor? It absolutely has a significance. This lamp in any synagogue that you go to is called the Ner Tamid. And so when you go to different synagogues, here's your scavenger hunt. Look for the Ner Tamid. It's usually up front, usually near the ark. Maybe it's hanging down, maybe it's fixed to the wall. But Ner Tamid means eternal light or eternal candle, eternal flame. This goes back to the days of the ancient temple, and before that, even the Mishkan, the tabernacle, our portable sanctuary through the desert. We were instructed to build a lampstand of seven branches that was to be lit and stay lit all the time, right? And so that any time of day or night, anybody who came into the holy space, their path would be illuminated. And today we don't have a Mishkan. Today we don't have a temple, or like rather the centralized temple where we had the sacrificial cult going on. But we have many things in our holy Jewish spaces that reflect those things. And the one most enduring and probably most prevalent is the Ner Tamid. This is this eternal light that is always on. And just logistically speaking, how do you do that? Usually there's 2 or 3 or 4 bulbs in there. And so, all kind of started at a different time so that if one goes out, the whole thing doesn't go out and you just replace that bulb. I learned this by being a synagogue rabbi for a little while and watching the custodian work. And so the significance of this is it connects to that time in the temple that, we had sort of 2 main pieces of furniture in the temple. There was the mizbach, the altar, that was used often but occasionally, sort of periodically, morning, afternoon, and evening for sacrifices and things like that. But then opposite the altar, you had the lamp, which was to be lit eternally. This is connected also, incidentally, to the miracle of Hanukkah, right? When the Seleucids, which were sort of a group of Hellenized Syrians, conquered Jerusalem, turned our temple over into idol worship, chased the faithful Jews into the hills. The Jews fought back, regained the temple, cleaned up all the schmutz, and the first thing they wanted to do, once it was all clean and ready to go, was relight this lamp. The trouble was they could only find one vessel of consecrated oil for that purpose. And they knew that, okay, that's a day's worth of oil, and it takes 8 days to make more. So they faced the question, do we start making more oil, wait 7 days, and then light this last vessel of oil on that last day, knowing that we would have oil the next day? Or do we follow this intention of having a Ner Tamid as soon as possible, light the oil, and it may go out, and then we'll get more oil later? But they said, we're going to go ahead and fulfill this. We're going to light this Ner Tamid, connected to every Ner Tamid you see in a synagogue today. And they did, and because they had the faith to do that, it said that that oil lasted until more oil could be made, and that lasted 8 days, and that's deep into the story of Hanukkah that we tell today. Incidentally, a lot of churches have adopted this as well. If you go into a Christian church, I challenge you to look up in the front to see if there's something that looks like a light that's always on, and they got that from us. So also baptism and the whole bread and wine thing. So I'm not knocking it; they have their own interpretation of that. But you heard it here, You heard it here first, folks. We got William weighing in from Waukeba Springs, Florida. Welcome, William. Nice to see you. Let's see. Karen asks how to deal with meal invitations that are spontaneous, as I have diet restrictions. So That is a perfectly appropriate question to ask. We have values of hospitality and not just offering hospitality, but accepting hospitality. At the same time, part of hospitality is that hospitable person accepting you for who you are. And so if you have dietary restrictions, and this goes for people who are, keeping kosher, and maybe they get diet invitations from people who don't, or maybe they get meal invitations from people who don't keep kosher, or maybe it's a gluten thing, maybe it's a food allergy. In any case, the nicest thing you can do is be honest. Someone once said that the kindest thing you can do for somebody is just show them who you really are, let them know where you stand. And so I would say thank you, and I would say just so you understand, there's certain things that I can't eat. However, I'm delighted to eat in your home, and thank you, and that's very nice of you to offer. So don't be shy about those things, because you're actually not doing yourself any favors, but you're also not doing your host any favors. And so if someone invites you over to eat at their house, I'm going to guess 9 times out of 10, it's not because they want to show off their cooking. It's because they like you and want to get to know you. And it's not about the food, right? It's about you and building that relationship. And so I'll say most worthy hosts would have no problem adjusting what it is they're making. And look, if they do have a problem adjusting what they're making for your dietary needs, then maybe that relationship's not going to go anyplace anyway. So I would just say, if somebody invites you over, say thank you first and foremost. Say, just so you know, there's certain things that I can't eat. I don't want you to take that personally. That's me. That's not you. And it's not a judgment on your cooking or cuisine or what have you. And I'll say sometimes that can get a little hairy. Sometimes that can get a little tricky. I'm not going to say there's never going to be any friction, but show gratitude. Be honest with who you are and what your needs are. Make it clear to them that it's not about them, it's about you, and it's no judgment on their hospitality. And I think things can be okay. In that vein, Susan shares, I was invited to the rabbi's home for the first night of Passover. I would like to be invited again this year. We have a Seder matching, but I would love to go to the rabbi's house again. So just ask. Just say, look, Rabbi, I really enjoyed the experience last year. Is it possible that I could join you again this year? And the answer may be no. I mean, they may have a full table, and they may be hoping that you get to know some other people in the congregation. But if you have that desire, again, just be honest with who you are and express that. And if they're not able to accommodate you, they'll let you know, and they'll find another nice place for you. William asks, what validity do you place, maybe he's asking me personally, on DNA testing to discover your Jewish roots? Do most rabbis recognize Jewish genetic profile in the excuse me, in the context for conversion? So I'm going to say this is a fairly new technology that doesn't significantly improve on our old technology for determining Jewishness. By and large, over the last, let's say, 2,000 years, the standard for whether someone was Jewish, and it is, I'm going to say, a little bit binary in this. You're either you're either fully Jewish or you're not Jewish. And some people say, well, I'm half Jewish, my mother's this, my father's this, or my father's this, my mother's this. When it comes to how you can participate in a Jewish community, whether you can count in a minyan, whether you have certain rights and responsibilities in a synagogue or in Jewish life, it's kind of in or out in a sense. And the way we recognize Jewishness is if your mother was Jewish, or if you convert to Judaism through the standards of by the standards of the community that you seek to be a part of. In the last century, the Reform movement modified this a little bit to say, okay, if your mother wasn't Jewish but your father was, and you were raised with a Jewish identity, then you're considered fully Jewish as well. I'm not going to say that the genetic testing thing hasn't made it interesting. I've had more than one person come into my office and say, hey, Rabbi, I just figured out that I'm 0.76% Jewish. now what do I do? Like, to what time do I have to come to services? Is there a donation required? Things like that. And I'll say, okay, that's interesting. It's certainly a cause to explore your own family tree. And many people connect this sort of Kabbalistically to the notion of a Pintel Yid. There's this sort of Jewish spark in some people that maybe they're not fully recognized as Jewish, but they have this Jewish spark inside them. And that's what compels them to learn more about their heritage or whatever the source of this interest is, and compels people to begin learning. And so once you start on that path, you may decide, well, yes, I've got a little bit of Jewish ancestry, but it's really not for me, and that's fine. You take your own path. But if somebody comes to me and says, well, I'm 49% Jewish or I'm 51% Jewish, I'm still going to have to ask, well, was your mother Jewish? Or have you had a formal conversion? Like, I think it's interesting. I think it's been cool to see how this has awakened some people's consciousness to something in their heritage they didn't know about. But there's no, let's say, mathematical determination for Jewishness. It's pretty much, in most Jewish communities, either your mother's Jewish or you converted, or in some Jewish communities, your mother or your father was Jewish and you were raised as a Jew. And then but I also want to take great pains to say that doesn't, that binary nature doesn't erase the Jewishness that you have in you. Just because you're not, let's say, officially a member of the tribe, doesn't deny the Jewish part of you. And for people who have Jewish ancestry, recent or in the distant past, and come to us at the Beit Din, often we'll discuss that not as a conversion per se, but more a recertification, if you will. We are officially recognizing this part of you that has been with you for a long time. We just have to go through a little bit of paperwork. As Rabbi Warren Levy on the Beit Din here locally says, it's a little bit like getting a copy of your birth certificate, right? You show up at the county courthouse and you need a copy of your birth certificate for some sort of, transaction or legal matter. You don't have a copy of it. Your parents can't find a copy of it. So you have to go to the county registrar or whatever and say, I need a copy of my birth certificate. Well, it's not like they're going to look at you and say, well, can you prove that you were born? Because clearly, by virtue of you standing there, you were born. You exist as a human being. However, there are certain steps that you have to take to prove that you were born at a certain time and place, and then you get the official paperwork, and it gets stamped and notarized, and that's what that process is. So I'll say to anybody out there who is discovering Jewishness in their family's path, So I'll say to anybody out there who is now discovering Jewishness in their family's past, if that prompts your curiosity, I'd welcome us beginning that conversation. Right? I can't say that based on percentages and some genetic tests that you sent through the mail or whatever, that I can say that you're Jewish or not Jewish, but I'm dying to help satisfy your curiosity and walk you through that path if you decide to convert because of that. Let's see. CJ Mays asks a great question. Do products labeled vegan need a hechsher? So I'll say there are differing opinions on this. Personally, my feeling is if something is labeled as vegan, it has gone through a rigorous certification process where people inspect the plant, make sure there are no animal ingredients in there whatsoever. And if that's true, then the item is considered under Kashrut parv. It's neither milk nor meat. So if it's vegan, it is by definition not made of any kind of animal product. And there are even some animal products that are considered parv as well, like fish or eggs. But if it's certified vegan and you trust the certifying body, you can be sure that there's no meat or milk in there. And so kashrut labeling with a hechsher isn't strictly necessary for people who go by things like reading ingredients and trusting certifying bodies outside of kashrut. There are those for whom they won't buy a processed food product unless it has been inspected and certified by a Jewish certifying body, such as the Orthodox Union or other certifying bodies. And so for some people, if it doesn't have a hechsher on it, it doesn't come into their kitchen, and that's fine. That's one way of doing Jewish. But I'll say, me personally, if I see a product is labeled vegan, I know that I have some assurance that it has gone through some rigorous inspection process to make sure there's no animal products in there, and so I don't have to worry whether milk or meat ever touched each other. Some people are concerned that this vegan product might have been processed at a plant that also processes milk or meat. Many times when you see a hechsher that says like OUD or something like that, or it's got the hechsher and then it's got a little D next to it, it certifies that as kosher dairy. Many times the D, and so people will look at the ingredients and say, well, there's no milk products in this whatsoever. Why does it say D? The D is to certify that it has been produced on dairy equipment. The only thing that I've seen where it actually spells out dairy equipment is, I want to say popsicles. There's a certain brand of popsicles that will have a hechsher, and then it says that the popsicles, even though the popsicles themselves contain no dairy products, it's just fruit and water and juice and corn syrup and whatnot, because it was made on dairy equipment, some people shy away from, let's say, having those popsicles after a steak dinner. However, if you go deep into the laws of kashrut, if you have something on which, a popsicle was made, you can be pretty sure that it was washed last time the IDA or the factory or the conveyor belt or whatever had dairy on it, and there'd probably been a period of time lapsed of 24 hours or more, in which case that equipment would not transfer the dairy status to the item. And so I know I'm getting a little inside baseball here. I follow some very traditional authorities who are strict about kashrut, but also strict about reading the fine print of all the rules of kashrut instead of putting a stricture on a stricture on a stricture to be safe without actually understanding the laws of kashrut. And so I'm not judging anybody who has to have a union label on the can before they bring it in the house. Most synagogues I'm a part of, that's the strict policy of the synagogue kitchen. If it doesn't have a hechsher, it can't come into the synagogue kitchen. And that's to make sure that everybody in the community is comfortable with that status. That is a move toward inclusion, right? If everybody's comfortable eating there, then more people are included in the community. And so personally, if I was going to a synagogue event and I was buying food that was going to be served at the synagogue, and I look at a package of something and it says it's vegan, I wouldn't take it to the synagogue and put it in the kitchen there. However, if I'm just eating at my own home, feeding my own family, if I see that something is labeled vegan, I have that trust that I'm not going to violate kashrut by mixing milk and meat if I eat that with anything else. So that's my answer. Many rabbis will vary on that, and many communities as well will vary on that. So if you're asking for yourself, game on. If you're asking for, should I be allowed to take this thing into a synagogue, that really has to go by the standards of that synagogue and that rabbi in that community. So just ask. That is always a good policy. So, going to take a little pause here and jump right into the questions. So CJ May has asked, how do you do kosher personally? Do you eat meat? I've increasingly met rabbis who are pescatarian, fish only. And so I gave a little bit of an answer to that just now. How do I do kosher personally? Well, I take kashrut very seriously. We were talking about it last week in our Parshat HaShavua class. So I take it seriously, but my kashrut might not look like every other rabbi's kashrut out there. I believe strongly in not mixing milk and meat. And let's see, where do I want to go with this? This is kind of a big question because kashrut sort of pervades keeping kosher sort of pervades like every minute of my day. So it would take me at least 24 hours to answer that question. But I'll say I stick to the traditional rules of kashrut as you might find them in Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy and in the Talmud. However, there are some kosher practices that people keep that I don't necessarily keep. I'll go to a friend of mine, Gil, once said, if you find the person who is the strictest observer of kashrut that you know, There is a rule in Kashrut somewhere where you could ask them about it and said, "Oh, well, do you do this too?" And they'll say, "No, that's for crazy people," right? So there's lots of laws on the books. People adopt them to a certain degree by their community standards, by their family practices, by their own personal choice. And so I have my version of that. My version of that means I will eat in most restaurants. I don't require that a restaurant has to have a certification, but I won't eat meat in those restaurants. I do personally eat meat, but when I eat meat, I only eat meat that I know is kosher in the sense that it's been slaughtered in the kosher way, supervised. Luckily, we have access to a lot of kosher butchers and supermarkets here in LA. So if I go to a restaurant, for example, I don't eat meat at that restaurant, but I might eat a dairy dish or a salad at that restaurant. What else is important to cover? So when I eat meat, it's by and large at home or in the home of somebody I know who only eats kosher meat. So things like that. I don't eat cheeseburgers anymore. I miss them very much. I came from Texas where cheeseburgers are very popular, and not just in Texas. But when I eat fish, I eat kosher fish with fins and scales. I do not insist that dairy be chalav Yisrael, meaning there are certain people who follow a practice that their dairy can only come from places that have been certified that only Jewish people work there. This goes back hundreds of years to some weird superstition that, if you had a person who wasn't Jewish milking the cows, they might adulterate the milk with pig milk or camel milk or something like that. This just goes to a personal philosophy of trust. There are those who follow kashrut in a way that if I don't know for 100% certain that nothing was messed with, I'm not going to eat it. Right? If I only eat things that I'm 100% sure, layer upon layer of supervision, that nothing could possibly go wrong. I tend to err on the side of trust that if I'm eating something that's labeled vegan, I trust that people aren't trying to fool me, right? I trust that people aren't trying to spoil my diet. And so I trust that if I go someplace that, if I'm eating something vegetarian or dairy, that restaurant has a high turnover in pots and pans and things like that. So the chances of me eating something that was mixed with meat at any point is small. I check when I'm looking for something, when I'm looking for processed foods, I'll check to see if it's got a hechsher on it. If it doesn't have a hechsher on it, but I can be reasonably sure that it doesn't have meat products in there, I'll read the ingredients and things like that. And that's, I'll say, kind of how I came into Judaism, was in a household like this, where they had kosher butchers in the family. And yet their way of keeping kosher, while fairly strict, I mean, there was a lot of things we couldn't eat, they would go by ingredients rather than strictly doing everything belt and suspenders, as I like to say. Nevertheless, this is something I think about all day, every day, in the sense that while I don't follow it the same way everybody else does, it is deep into my Jewish mindfulness. And for me, that's really what kashrut is about, is taking care, being mindful, doing your best, and exercising that level of care and self-discipline in an area of life where most people don't even think about it. And that feels kosher to me. So anybody has a different way of doing it. I don't judge, but people ask, so I gave my particular practice. So let's see what else is going on here. Carla asks a great technical question about buying eggs before Passover for them to be kosher LePesach. Otherwise, they're not if you buy during Passover. So let's see. How do I want to answer this question? So as we're going to do, we've been having some great lessons on preparing for Passover in the Jew Curious School. We'll have more in the YouTube Live here in the coming weeks. Probably starting next week, we'll get into Passover questions and things like that. But just because you ask, and I said you can ask me anything, there are certain things that how do I put this? There are certain things that you can buy during Passover, and it's fine to buy them during Passover. And there are certain things you want to buy before Passover, but you can't buy them and eat them during Passover. And this usually has to do with sort of the level of process and things that go into the food. If you're buying during Passover, you can buy fruits and vegetables, that level of raw ingredient, like raw fruit, raw produce, things like that during Passover, being reasonably assured that there's not a lot of grains and stuff mixed in with them. Once you get above that level of basic vegetable staples and things like that, when we get into milk and eggs and items that have been processed in some way, I mean, the eggs come out of the chicken, they don't go right into the carton. There are people who sort them and all sorts of stuff. And because egg farms, have a lot of grains lying around because the chickens are eating eggs, and people have, sometimes found bits of grain and things on the eggs. So eggs and milk are the kind of thing that if you buy them before Passover, you can eat them during Passover, because any sort of chametz that might be attached to them or touching them or whatever is taken care of by this thing we do called bitul chametz. After you clean for Passover, right around noonish on Erev Pesach, there is a formula that we recite, sometimes accompanied by the burning of a piece of bread. Like you do biur hametz, like you're going through finding all the hametz in your house. You get some pieces of bread, you throw them on the grill or on the fire or something, and say, okay, we are symbolically we're burning this hametz, but we're also symbolically burning away any hametz that it might be left in our house that we might have missed. And then we recite this prayer in Aramaic that's in the Haggadah that says, any hametz left in my possession, I hereby disavow and consider it as the dust of the earth. And so if you have a fridge full of milk and eggs and things like that, which don't necessarily need kosher LePesach hechsher, but if you have these kinds of things, and this applies to eggs, and they're in your possession, and you say this legal formula that disavows any hametz that might be on them, then those eggs are okay for the rest of Pesach. However, if you buy the eggs during Pesach, then they might still have some chametz and that have been come into your possession. It seems terribly unlikely. This is an Ashkenazic minhag, a way of doing Passover that we've been doing for many generations, but that's why we do it. There's certain things, anything processed. I'm a big coffee drinker. You may not know that about me, but let's clear that up right now. If you buy, let's say you have terrible taste, like I do, and you buy coffee by the crate of Folgers crystals, right? Or I drink, I drink Folgers most of the time. Don't get any money from the Folgers people. Don't shout at me if you're a Maxwell House person. They make a great Haggadah. But I drink a lot of coffee. And so I'll get big tubs of coffee at a time. And it says on the label there, 100% coffee. If it's on my shelf and I recite this bitul chametz formula, then any chametz that might be left in that coffee is like, look, I didn't buy it for the chametz. I bought it for the caffeine, frankly. But any kind of chametz that's left in that can is disavowed and annulled. And so I can drink that coffee for the rest of the week. I can't, God forbid I run out of coffee during the week. I would go to the store and look for coffee that is certified kosher for Passover, because I can't buy regular coffee and then annul its hametz. I have to buy coffee that's already been supervised as kosher LePesach. So that's a long answer to a very short question. I hope that touches on it, and I'm sure we'll have many more questions about Passover coming up. Let's see. Michael Pacheco, welcome to the chat. Michael asks, any good book suggestions on Kashrut for those of us who struggle to keep it all straight? So, no. let me back up. There's a book, probably the one that got me started, and that I recommend. It's some of the resources in the back are a little bit dated, but this is a great place to start for people in many different areas of Jewish life and Jewish law and Jewish practice, and that is Rabbi Brad Artson's book, It's a Mitzvah. So it's Artson. He's got a book, It's a Mitzvah, and I should shout because it's got a little exclamation point at the end. And this book goes over a bunch of different areas of Jewish life, from Kashrut and Shabbat and social justice and modesty and ethical speech, all sorts of different areas. And it takes a deep dive into how to get started with these various mitzvot. And so for really complicated areas like Shabbat and Kashrut, they have a lot of rules that are tough to keep straight. I believe Rabbi Artson gives a great methodology for working your way into these things, because I'll say the best way to keep it straight is to not try to do all of it at once. And Rabbi Artson will walk you through, okay, first, maybe you decide to stop eating shellfish, right? And try that out for a couple weeks. Then stop eating pork, right? And then maybe you decide to not mix meat and milk. Then maybe after that you decide that the only meat you're going to eat is meat from a kosher place. And maybe you decide to stop going to restaurants that aren't certified. And so he does a great way of like laying the different things out in stages that you can adopt piece by piece. And then we'll have some references to other books that can kind of take a deep dive. Like where I study Kashrut from is largely like the Shulchan Aruch and the Talmud and those kinds of texts, which I wouldn't recommend for a beginner. So just personally, I went from Rabbi Artson's It's a Mitzvah into Hilchot Basar V'Chalav, like hard stuff. And so I'd say start with Rabbi Artson's book, and there are probably lots of other great resources out there, including the ones that he recommends in his book. So that's where I would start. Let me go back through the chat to see what I missed. CJ asks, if you eat dairy in a non-kosher restaurant, how do we know the cheese doesn't contain rennet? What's the conservative view on that? I don't keep kosher. He says, I've struggled off and on, but curious about this. So there was a great tshuva, I want to say maybe back in the 60s by... looking at my bookshelf to get the name straight, by Rabbi Isaac Klein, who discusses, it's not in this book, but he wrote a tshuva or a legal responsum on the status of cheeses. And he went through different factories and places where cheeses were made. The question comes up, does cheese contain rennet? Rennet is an enzyme that is used as a coagulant, or I don't know if that's the right word for it. But anyway, rennet is an enzyme that's used to separate curds and whey. Back in the day when they were making cheeses, the most effective way to do this was they would have dried calf stomachs, stomachs that had been taken out of slaughtered calves and dried out, because the enzymes that were still present in the dry calf stomachs could curdle a pot of milk just like that. And so what they would do is clip off a little piece of dried calf stomach lining, throw it in a vat of milk, and immediately the curds and whey would separate, because that's how baby cows digested their milk. And so that made cheese kind of problematic for people keeping kosher, because it was a piece of meat that was literally thrown into milk in order to make the cheese. And it's possible for, if you make a mistake and accidentally drop a little bit of meat into milk, you can remedy that. But that's only after the fact. You can't do that intentionally. And so for many years, people weren't eating cheeses that they didn't certify for sure didn't have a calf stomach lining piece thrown into it. However, Rabbi Klein went through and inspected various facilities, talked to food scientists, and discovered that for the most part, discovered to his satisfaction that pretty much all the cheese made in the United States of America doesn't use animal rennet, unless it's sort of an artisanal cheese producer or it's imported from another country. Pretty much anything you buy in a big block at the grocery store, or a big bag of shredded cheese or whatever, was coagulated using chemical agents rather than enzymes taken directly from a calf. And so what Rabbi Wise said was that, unless you have evidence to the contrary, you could assume that all domestically produced, and that means domestic in the United States, I can't speak for other countries, but all cheese domestically produced in the United States could be considered kosher, meaning you weren't violating, milk and meat being mixed if you ate it. And so that is the conservative movement take. I take that tack as well. If I'm eating a cheese that's not necessarily from the United States, I will look. Was it made with animal rennet? Many with great food labeling laws these days. I go to Trader Joe's quite a bit that has a variety of cheeses, and it'll say it was made out of microbial rennet or something else other than And sometimes it'll say animal rennet was used, and I avoid that. But if it's microbial unit or rennet or something like that, I don't really worry about it. And if I'm buying cheese that I know was sort of mass produced domestically, I go by Rabbi Klein's tshuva on that we don't have to worry about mixing meat and milk. Okay, had a few more things. Let's see. We're about at 10 o'clock. I'm going to have to wrap this up pretty soon just to make sure I can get this out in a podcast in a timely way. And gosh, of course, we're getting some really, really good questions in here right at the end. So I'm going to take a couple of questions that are actually pretty important. I don't want to dodge these until next week, but let's go ahead and jump into them. And then after that, I'm not going to answer any questions. So please save them. We'll do another Ask Me Anything. Just so you know, for housekeeping purposes, we have a live every day this week, mostly at 9. But just want to call out that tomorrow our show isn't at 9 Pacific time. It's at 2 p.m. Pacific time. Just had a couple of unavoidable commitments that I couldn't plan around. So tomorrow's live will not be at 9 a.m. Pacific. It will be at 2 p.m. Pacific time, and it's scheduled that way on YouTube. And then we'll be meeting 9 a.m. for, let's say Wednesday through Friday. So let me get to a couple of great questions before we sign off. Let's see. I'm going to have to come back to Carmen's because Carmen's a deeper question that I want to answer another time. Sorry about that, Carmen. Let's see. Karen asks, after death, Jews are buried in the ground, but what happens to those and she names a particular Jewish celebrity whose parents cremated her? Is cremation a no-no? Really curious. So the Jewish tradition for a very long time has frowned upon cremation from a number of different points. And again, let me caveat this. I'm not going to ding anybody who decides to be cremated, whose parents cremated them after they died. God, the worst thing in the world is losing a child. Who am I to say to somebody that, oh, you did it wrong in burying your child? That's awful, I think. When people ask me, when people are planning for their own burial or their own, whatever happens to them after they die, I bring in the tradition that says we really prefer not to cremate people for a few different reasons. There is an old teaching about Tihat Metim in the sense that when Mashiach comes, that there will be a bodily revival of the dead. But it won't be like scary and creepy things like that. It'll be like people come back to life and retain their bodies whole. And anything that we do to impair that body is contrary to that idea. And I'll set that aside for a second because you don't have to believe that people will come back, because people say, well, then you can't donate organs, and gosh, what happens to an amputee? God forbid. What if somebody who died in a fire and was horribly disfigured was cremated against their will? We have a whole episode of our history, the Shoah, where millions of people were cremated against their will. What happens, right? So in general, we don't do things intentionally to desecrate a dead body, right? We don't do embalming, not just because of the desecration aspect, because this is a very Egyptian thing to do, and we like to avoid doing things the Egyptian way. So we don't do embalming. We don't do autopsies unless it is absolutely necessary in a way that might save other people. So if somebody dies of a mysterious illness, maybe it's worthwhile doing an autopsy to see, is this a communicable disease that we can put a stop to before it hurts other people? Or if somebody was the victim of a crime, and by doing an autopsy, we could identify the person who killed them and prevent anybody else from getting hurt. Barring those extreme circumstances, we don't do autopsy. We try not to destroy the body in any way or violate just the way the corpse is. And that's for a very good reason. We don't do, for the most part, open casket funerals. Have I been to a Jewish funeral that was open casket? Yes, I have. But For the most part, we don't do that. We just wash the remains, wrap them up in a dignified way, and the funeral is, has them in a closed casket, and that casket is placed in the earth. So the reasons that the tradition frowns upon cremation is we don't destroy the body. We just put it in the earth so it goes from its natural state back to its previous natural state, dust to dust. Our bodies came from the earth, and our bodies should return to the earth, right? In addition to that, because of the Shoah, because there were people whose tradition was violated, and there were many other things violated, but because people were not only murdered, but they were cremated against their will, in memory of those people, we don't encourage cremation today. Are there Jews opting for this? Yes, there are. Burial is expensive, right? There are lots of aspects to it that, sometimes cremation is cheaper. Sometimes people have this complex. They're like, oh, I don't want to take up so much room. For me, I think that has more to do with people's fear of death. But I'll just say the Jewish tradition doesn't bend toward cremation. Are there Jews that do it? Yes. There are some rabbis who won't officiate funerals of people who've been cremated. Personally, I will, just because if people ask me how they should be laid to rest, I encourage burial in the traditional way. But if somebody needs a memorial service for somebody who's been cremated, either on purpose or not, I'll still honor the people who passed, because we're honoring the people who passed, not their remains. So I hope that answers that question. Again, traditionally, we don't cremate. Are there Jews who do for various reasons? Yes. When people ask my opinion, I tell them not to do cremation, but I don't judge people for how they respond to mourning and suffering. And then the final question I want to take on today, let's see. And then I'm sorry, Carmen, you asked a great question, but it's a bigger question than we can get to today. I don't want to tease it. Carmen, it says, I deal with a lot of guilt. How do I work through that in order to obtain? Carmen asks, I deal with a lot of guilt. How do I work through that to obtain a more fulfilling Jewish existence or life? And for me, even though there's a stereotype of like Jewish guilt and stuff like that, I'll say for me, Jewish life is the life that does the most to free us from that ongoing guilt, because it's said that even before human beings were created, tshuva was created. Tshuva is our process of taking a look at our lives, improving those things where we want to improve, making amends with people we might have hurt. We have a very clearly laid out technology of how do I face those things that I've done that I'm not proud of? How do I face a sense of guilt for things maybe I'm not even responsible for? And so I would work through processes of tshuva, as is spelled out in Maimonides and several other Jewish texts on this, really recognizing those things which may be out of your control. And thus, I would invite you to let go of any guilt about things that are out of your control. And the things that were in your control, we have ways of making amends, of going to that person and trying to make it right. And if we keep going back to that person and they don't let us make it right, well, Maimonides says that's on them, that's not on you, right? We make best efforts to make amends. And so, again, even though there's a stereotype that Jewishness is like a guilt-ridden civilization, I firmly believe that we have one of the best ways of dealing with guilt. And maybe it's not despite, maybe it's because of. So I hope that's helpful for you, and I hope we can unpack that more in future discussions. I wanted to answer one last question. Keith Giamatti asks, Christians using talit and tzitzit, your thoughts? So I have thoughts on this that might not be terribly popular to some Jew-curious people. I encourage Christians to explore Jewish roots of their own faith. I discourage cultural appropriation in the sense of, if you are going to be a Christian, be a Christian. If you want to do some Jewish practices, like celebrate the biblical festivals in a Jewish way, I think that's awesome. I learned the statistic a few years ago that there are actually more Christians who buy talitot, those prayer shawls, than there are Jews, right? Because there's a billion some Christians, 15 to 20 million Jews. And just the math works out that there are going to be more Christians buying talitot than Jews. And I'm not a huge fan in the sense of, on the one hand, many Jewish practices were adopted by Christianity a very long time ago and have morphed into very Christian things. Kiddush and motzi, meaning like having a cup of wine and a loaf of bread on holidays and in Shabbat services, morphed into communion that has a very deep, significant meaning to Christians, right? Am I going to say you can't have wine and bread? Absolutely not, but do it your way. This has come up a lot lately with Passover Seders. Can Christians do Passover Seders? Wasn't the Last Supper a Passover Seder? I read a great letter from a bishop on this a couple of years ago who went through the elements of the Last Supper and said, based on the timing of the day of the week, it literally could not have been a Seder, a Passover Seder. However, it had lots of elements to it that were Seder-like, and it was probably a model Seder, or Jesus using the Seder as a teaching tool to teach his disciples something else. And so if you've got wine and bread, if you've got, this Last Supper reenactment, if you've got baptism, which comes straight from the practice of tevilah, of immersing in a mikveh, if it is your tradition and you're adopting it from your forebears and people who were doing it before you, that's fine. But if you are a Christian who is going into Jewish spaces to say, okay, I'm going to take this back, I'm going to take this back, I'm going to take this back, if you're recognizing in your own way, I guess that's fine. I mean, the priests have been wearing stoles for a very long time now that were, started off as a prayer shawl and then morphed from there. Don't ask me why the Pope wears a yarmulke and all the bishops in the Vatican wear a yarmulke. I'm sure they have reasons for that. But I'll say if you're digging into your Christianity, dig into your Christianity and pick up those practices within that Christianity that you can, and you don't need to sort of take how a Seder is done today, because the Seder is probably done a very different, if you're trying to be closer to Jesus, a Seder today is very different than a Seder was in the time of Jesus, right? A talit probably looks very different from what a talit looked like 2,000 years ago. And I know that it's done out of respect. I know that it's done to sort of feel closer to your faith. However, I would just challenge you to think about whether what you're doing is appropriating somebody else's culture in ways that those people might have a problem with. This came up at Hanukkah, where we had some horrible acts of violence and vandalism over the winter, and people thought, hey, I'm not a Jewish person, but I'm going to light a menorah out of solidarity with my Jewish brothers and sisters. And many Jews felt weird about that, and they said, please don't. Like, you celebrate your holiday. There's lots of ways you can express solidarity without appropriating our holiday. And so if people have particular questions about this, like where is that line, we can talk about that further. But I'll say you have ways of dressing for your church. You don't need to adopt ways from our thing. So that's just my frank answer to that question. We're going to call it for today. We've been going for about 75 minutes now, and I really want to make sure that this gets edited into a podcast sometime today, as well as I've got to go to a synagogue to start planning for our Seder coming up here in about 3 weeks, y'all, is when Passover is coming. So if you'll give me just a moment, I'm going to go ahead and do the radio announcer-y voice stuff of signing off on the podcast. I'll stay for just a couple minutes after that just to give high fives to all the great people who've joined us today. Many people, Keith, Ari, CJ, Kathy, people I didn't catch in the beginning. Really grateful to have all y'all here. All right, so here, let me take a little sip, and then we'll wrap it up. Looks like we topped double minion today, which I'm super excited about. So let's do this. So I want to wrap this up and thank everybody for being in the live studio audience today. It turns out, always to my great surprise, I'll say I'm no longer surprised by your questions, but I am continually impressed. I'm super grateful to the live studio audience who has joined us today, has asked some great questions that I think will be helpful for the Jew Curious Show audience. And that brings me to you, Hero. Thank you so much for listening to this live recording. If you'd like to join us yourself in the future, go to YouTube, look for me, Rabbi John Carrier, and see other live streaming opportunities coming up where you can get your questions answered live, and those answers can go out to listeners of this show. Another great way to connect with people in this community is by joining the Jew Curious Community Center. You can find out how to do that by going to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. Sign up for that. You'll get instructions on how to join this carefully tended and troll-free private community where you can share your story, ask your questions, get support, give support, and just be, and excuse me, and just hang out with Jew Curious people just like you. One final favor I'd like to ask, and as an aside, if anybody watching this has enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, click that little like button right there. Okay, back to the podcast. One final favor I want to ask. If you have enjoyed this podcast, gotten anything out of it at all, please let us know by going to iTunes and leaving us a rating and or review. Give us the appropriate number of stars and leave us a little note to let us know how we're doing. If you do that, I would be, as we say in Texas, much obliged. Until next time, Hero. Peace. All right, just going to go back into the chat a little bit. I know there's a lot of stuff I miss when I do this, and some questions I miss that people are asking. So sorry I didn't answer every single question we got here today. I just have to cap it in an hour just to make sure I get through the rest of my day as well. But I really appreciate some new faces. Keith is coming in. And Keith, I want to express solidarity with you, brother. I know there are lots of Christians who are keeping biblical holidays, trying on different mitzvot as a part of their path. I guess what I don't, if somebody wants to privately take on the mitzvot of tzitzit while they're figuring out their path, I don't judge that. I don't exclude folks from that. I guess what I don't like is when people in big public ways, I see this a lot on like TV shows, in big public ways, making a show out of appropriating a Jewish item. There was a political thing recently where a big TV pastor was praising a political leader, gave them something that looked very much like a talit, and I guess that's what their way to do church. The problem that I have is that now I know Jews who are shopping for talitot, and they go to a store looking for a Jewish talit, and the blessing that's printed on it contains the name of Jesus. And so sometimes things get misrepresented and lines get crossed. So my biggest thing to say is go into it mindfully, go into it respectfully, ask questions along the way, and I think that's the best way forward for everybody. And maybe I'll edit this answer back into the podcast. So I don't want to be insensitive to this, but I do have strong feelings here and there. So thank you, everybody, for a great discussion. Elizabeth, Sister Spooky, thanks for reading up on this. Keith, thank you for joining us. And yeah, just super excited to learn with every single one of you today. My gratitude grows and grows with more people who join us for this. But I want everybody to know that I'm grateful for you personally. It's not about numbers for me. It's about connecting with people and answering people's questions. So I think we did a good job together today. I know I missed some questions in the chat, so keep bringing them up. I'm going to do an Ask Me Anything every single week. Later in this week, we're talking about a few things. So check out my YouTube channel just to see. I scheduled them all this morning and then immediately forgot what we're going to be talking about this week. I think we're going to be talking about some very big questions like why bad things happen to good people and what happens after we die. A few different Jewish responses to that, because I think these two questions are the biggest questions that any religion is responsible for answering. And we have some of our answers as well. So tune in for those things. And of course, we'll be talking live about the Parshat HaShavua, the Torah portion of the week, on Friday this week at 9 a.m. So remember, tomorrow's not at 9 a.m., tomorrow's at 2 p.m. Rest of the week, it's at 9 a.m. Until next time, heroes, peace.